Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whenever it is that you're watching this video clip, and welcome to the fourth in the series of spiritual practices in everyday life. And today my conversation partner is the RevTony Robinson, a long-time friend of mine and the minister of Stellenbosch United Church. Welcome, Tony. It's lovely to be in conversation with you.
Thanks very much, George. Good to join you this morning.
So I just want to make a very short introduction, Tony, just to put those that have been watching these clips into the continuity of where we're going. We started out a couple of weeks ago talking about spiritual practices in everyday life, and we had to come to terms with a couple of reasons why spiritual practices may not be as popular in the Protestant tradition as they are in other places. So one of the things was people thought, well, this is a work, and the Reformers said, well, you can't get saved by works, so the way you get saved is by grace, and that costs nothing and requires nothing of us except the acceptance of what Christ did once for all upon the cross. And we looked at Dallas Willard, and one of the things that he discovered, which was that it's not a matter of earning salvation, it's a matter of exerting effort in our relationship with God. So we don't do it to achieve salvation, but we do it to have a closer walk with God. Just like you and I will have to do things like this in our friendships and in our marriages and in our relationship with aged parents and things like that. We have to exert effort, and spiritual practices are like that. And then I looked with Rod Botsis at hospitality, and with Peter Langeman at Visio Divina, using an icon or a painting to facilitate contemplative prayer. But today's one, I think, will be a little bit easier for many of those that are watching this to understand, because it is about Sabbath keeping. Now, I say that on the one hand because Sabbath is something that Protestants understand, but on the other hand, we are weighed down by the demands of a work ethic that persuades us that every time we rest is a waste of time. Every time we play, it's a waste of time. But maybe we should start at the beginning, Tony, before I complicate things. Where does Sabbath come from? In the Christian and the Jewish tradition, where does it come from?
Well, George, thanks for the intro. It helps me to had pegged this in the middle of a series. I think of Richard Foster's Celebration of Discipline, which I read as a teenager, which heaped guilt on my head because I began to feel guilty about all the things I wasn't doing as a Christian. So it's helpful to see it from a point of view of grace and a gift that God has given us. But to go back to origins, you get the impression when you read the book of Genesis that Sabbath began less as a command than as a discovery of the early people of Israel. And as is recorded in Genesis chapter 2, we have this story where God creates the heavens and the earth, and at the end of it, he ceases, he finishes everything he's done, he completes what he's done, and then he stops work. And the word used there to cease is the word Shabbat, from which we get Sabbath. It's the first time the word appears in the canon of the Bible. So we find this word Shabbat there. God ceased his labor, and it was after he had already said, this is very good. So he'd shown appreciation for the beauty of what had been created, and then he stopped. There's a sense here of a reason for stopping. Why would he stop? Well, just before this, it talks about completion. So in the first few verses of chapter 2, God completed. And the Hebrew word for finish, we talk about, I finished the job. The Hebrew word is the word kol, and it's a bit like the Greek word telos, to complete, the finish, the end of things. And it has much more of a sense of wholeness and completion. We get the sense that the people writing the Bible had already discovered that without this sense of completion, a Sabbath is not useful. And without a Sabbath, we don't really get a sense that things have been completed. But then God does two things. He in Genesis chapter 2, he blesses the day. And it's a word we read commonly. We say to people, "Be blessed," but the word means to be made joyful. There's a passivity about it. It's not something you gain for yourself. And I love that in terms of the grace aspect of the Sabbath. It's that you are blessed in the Sabbath. You don't do anything to be blessed. You simply are blessed. So God blesses the day. He offers his blessing for the day. And then he sets it apart. And the NIV, my NIV, says he made it holy. And this, I think, is the root of many of our problems with the Sabbath. We think it's holy, so we have to obey it. There's this special thing. Mom would say to you, now, don't break my special vase. And so we heap guilt on ourselves about the way we treat the day. But in fact, holiness in its origins is rather about being different than being particularly pure or special. And so this different day, it's different to every other day. It's different to the other days in which God created the heavens and the earth. But if we look at the rhythms of Genesis chapter 1 and up to chapter 2, where we read about the Sabbath, we notice that this is poetry. And the rhythm is the poetry of the Hebrew poetry there is it's well structured, and it forms this rhythm, which gives us a clue as to why it became so important in the early Israelite practices of temple and Sabbath and a regular rhythm of seasons and of months and of feasts and then of course of Shabbat, regularly going to the temple, that it became a weekly rhythm which punctuated the fabric of life. And of course, once the law was given, we find it entrenched in the life and law of Israel. But the fascinating thing is the law is given on Sinai, but mention of Sabbath occurs before the law is created. If you look at the journey of the Exodus up to Sinai, when God cares for the people, he gives specific provisions of things that can and can't be done on the Sabbath, and manna is one of them. You must collect a double portion on the day before the Sabbath. Do not collect on the Sabbath. Do not keep longer than the Sabbath, otherwise it goes rotten. And so the Sabbath is already built into the life of Israel. The rhythm of Sabbath is already built in, which of course begs the question when we come to Deuteronomy and the slavery, which we'll talk about later. Did they already have the rhythm which they were trying to impose under slavery? Was part of the dislocation and the unsettlement of slavery? Was it because they were finding it so incredibly difficult to fit this rhythm into a life of slavery and a life of perpetual work? So, of course, later on, we find the Sabbath entrenched in the life of the people with the Passover and the other feasts where Sabbath punctuated the feasts. And Sabbath was a holy day or a high day during the feast. And then the lovely story of Nehemiah during the rebuilding, and this is much later in the history of Israel, during the rebuilding of the temple, and we come to the rebuilding on the Solomon's temple precinct, they're rebuilding the temple, and Nehemiah notices while they're building the wall that people would come on the Sabbath, the outsiders, the foreigners, the other nations would come in and want to sell things in Jerusalem on Sabbath. And of course, he chased them out, but then they would stand outside the city wall and they would trade over the wall, as it were, the people of Israel. And in order to keep the Sabbath pure, he threatens them and says, you're not to do that, and you must go away, or I will lay hands on you, he says. I'm clearly meaning he's going to come and give them a bunch of fires. And the idea of Sabbath being a very important day in the relationship with God, in the relationship of Israel with God, and in the safety and security of Jerusalem, has by that stage grown. So it becomes more than a personal practice of a discipline, but actually something intrinsic in the security of Israel in terms of its relationship with God. So those are some of the origins. We could speak for hours on it, but some of the origins of how the Sabbath became entrenched in the regular life of Israel and temple worship.
Right. Thank you for that, Tony, because it gives us some absolutely beautiful, sort of kind of pegs to hang things on. I mean, one of the things you said that surprised me in when you said it, and I remembered, and it made sense to me, is this notion of joy. There is a joy that comes with Sabbath. It's not a chore. It's not a responsibility. It's not a burden. It's a joy. It's a freeing moment. And you set it in the litany of creation. There's a sense of completeness, and I think it is very important to draw attention to those who are watching this to something else that you said, and that is, we have so many areas in our lives nowadays that never seem to complete, and work that never seems to come to an end. But when God creates the world, He draws a line. It's possible for Him to have gone on ad infinitum, but He decides not to do so, and so entrenches a pattern, which is also applicable to human living. And then from the creation litany into the commandments. We have a Sabbath commandment. That's interesting. So it's not only a practice that is there in mimicking or imitating God, but it's also now a commandment. And I guess, if that's the kind of game we want to play, Israel, as an infant nation in terms of its development, needs strong rules. Isn't it interesting that God decided to, in inverted commas, waste one of the 10 on Sabbath? Why would God do that? There's surely more things to prohibit, murder, lies, and so on. But instead of adding just another prohibition, He puts in as one of the 10 this notion of Sabbath. Why do you think that is? Why would God have chosen to waste a commandment on Sabbath?
So you sent me an article by Barbara Brown-Taylor, who I know is a very dear person to you. And I love it. At the end of it, she talks about Sabbath as being an important day to recognize that we have no clue how to live. When we get to that point of realizing we have no clue, we allow God to invade a space in our lives, which allows us to feel helpless and yet utterly guided, utterly secure in His guidance. But she also says in another place in the article, she calls Sabbath a palace in time. And I just love that phrase. And I think for ancient Israel, the temple must have been something like that. You escape, in a sense, like we would to a holiday home, to this place, the temple. But when the temple's gone and the land is gone and we're in exile wherever we are, and we rely on the spiritual practices to continue in our lives, this Sabbath becomes the palace. It becomes one of the anchor points. So I'd like to just refer to this at the moment. I read recently, after finding him in a video I'd watched, James P. Koss, who was Professor Emeritus at New York University, and he was a specialist in game theory. Now, we all know about computer games and the way we play games, and he describes at least two types of game, but these two are in a sense opposites. The one is the finite game. Now, we all know the finite game. It's a game of rugby where we have known players, and even though we have substitutes, we know the pool of players, and those will be the only players playing. There are fixed rules, which the referee enforces through the game, and there's an agreed-upon objective. We're going to score points, and the one with the highest points wins. So that's a finite game. The final whistle goes, and we all go back to the change room, and one team has won, one team has lost. Now, our old computer games, Space Invaders and others, they had that kind of, sense of finiteness. They would begin, they would end, we'd win or we'd lose. But then he described a different kind of game, and he called it the infinite game. We find these games taking over nowadays in our computer and online games. And there are games in which the only objective is to perpetuate the game. We find that we have known players and we have unknown players. Somebody could enter anonymously and play the game, and then they will leave. And then the objective, the rules can change. They can change throughout the game, because perhaps there's something that changes and the game would end. If it didn't change, we'd need to change the rule in order to perpetuate the game. And so we have this interesting infinite game, which he then, being a Christian theologian as well, describes as the divine life, the life of God, one in which it continues from everlasting to everlasting, as we read. But we live in a finite world, and he describes this as something really unstable. So in game theory, if you have a finite player playing a finite player, there's stability. If you have an infinite player playing one of these online forever games that you can join and leave at any point, if you have two players playing in an infinite game, there's stability. But as soon as a finite player enters an infinite game, there's instability. Let's take a war game, for instance. A finite player enters and becomes crazy, does not consider the fact that he may end his time in the game, and just obliterates a whole lot of things, destroys them within the game. And so it makes it very difficult for the other infinite players to play. And so there's instability. And applying this to human life says, as we engage as finite people in an infinite existence of God, there's instability unless we recognize a few basic things. And so he begins to refer to the way God puts things down, these 10 commandments. So what happens in this infinite game is people drop out for two reasons. They either run out of resources or they run out of the will to play. And I love that. The point at which he recognized that was the point at which we get to, where we enter this infinite game without the right tools. We run out of resources. We run out of the rules, the will to play. And applying this to Sabbath, without the palace in time. You see, Jesus talks in the book of Mark and says that, and I never understood this before until I read this by James P. Carson. He says Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. And so if you imagine God making the time-space continuum as we know it, what God did not do was create a space and time every 7 days and think, oh, what should I do with that? There is this space and time. What should I do with it? Well, I'll fill it with a human, and then they have to conform to that space and time. In fact, what he did was he created the human. In his infinite wisdom and creativity, he creates this human, and then he creates these spaces and time for us, these beautiful moments in which we can, in a sense, escape that infinite game just for a moment to commune with the infinite God and regain our perspective, regain the beauty of who we are. I know that's a fairly long explanation, but it just explains to me how we as humans desperately need this gap, this palace in time, in order to regain our resources and our will to continue as we commune with the infinite God in that space. Does that make some sense, George?
That makes a whole lot of sense. And in fact, it reminds me, I wanted to mention this book by Walter Brueggemann. And in this little book, I mean, it's very thin. Look how thin it is. And Walter Brueggemann, is really usually very wordy. But I think the point that he makes in that book is that the people, having come out of Egypt, had to learn how to be free. And that connects exactly with what you're saying about play. When you work for Pharaoh and you're a slave, you don't get to decide. Pharaoh tells you when to stand. Pharaoh tells you when to sit. Pharaoh tells you how long you're going to work. And even in your off time, you got to gather the straw, for the bricks. Now, if you're a free person, i.e. you're just about to cross into the promised land, you take possession of the land, you're going to be a sovereign, little group until you become a kingdom of your own. You need to learn how to make your own decisions as a free person. Now, what Walter Brueggemann is saying is that Sabbath teaches freedom. On the Sabbath, you don't have to work. God didn't work on the Sabbath. Good enough for God, good enough for you. And you don't. You exert freedom in the presence of, I guess, the free market system, the neoliberal, economic system that we are under, capitalism. And you have to exert your freedom. You cease to work, and by doing so, you demonstrate your freedom. You are a free person, an individual, and you have only one king, and his name is Yahweh, and he does not demand of you 24 hours. Now, in this day and age, where people are working remotely, many people are taking contracts from clients across the world, so working on different time zones. And there is a never-ending set of demands. I think Sabbath is more necessary than ever before because our freedom is at risk. We become modern-day slaves. We have to do whatever work demands in order to survive, and that is called slavery. if you think about that, you may enjoy some comforts in your life as a result of your success. But if you are addicted to work, and if you're unable to stop work, then you are a slave. So do you see the correlation? I think it's a very important thing. And play is the way in which you stop work. You do something you enjoy, and that brings you closer to God in the process. And sometimes that might even involve worship and church things, but not work. That makes sense?
Yes. Yes. And where Eugene Peterson was quite helpful in that, because just a story about, I went to a Bible college before I went to study at university, theology at university. And it was quite a conservative Bible college theologically. And one of the rules was you weren't allowed playing games on the Sabbath. So you weren't allowed, our tennis court was out of bounds on the Sabbath. Only we got a new lecturer from Oxford University. Craig Bartholomew came to lecture at the college, and I was in his class for some things, and we used to meet together for tea. And the one Sunday afternoon, he said, "Come, guys, let's go and play tennis." And he was a faculty member, so we went to play tennis on a Sunday afternoon. Well, we got into such trouble, and he ended up in the principal's office for playing on a Sunday afternoon, the Sabbath. Well, Eugene Peterson is quite helpful in the way he talks about worship and prayer and playing on the Sabbath. And unless we experience the freedom from the rules that we make up on the Sabbath, we're not exercising that freedom from slavery. We become enslaved again to a new rule, which then, instead of freeing us to commune with God on that day, we become law watchers. We watch over the law. We feel like Peter says, imprisoned, because we are Sabbath breakers, and so we become imprisoned in our guilt. And I love the story of the two candles that are lit on the Shabbat evening for the Jewish people. The one reminding us of the origins of Sabbath in God's rest. God rested, and he blessed rest for us, this sense of looking back and evaluating and saying it is good. But also this, what you talked about, this freedom from slavery. And it comes up all over the place in the Old Testament, this idea you were slaves in Egypt, therefore. And the basis for this is in Exodus, God rested, therefore you rest. In Deuteronomy, you were slaves. So there are two different reasons given in the two accounts of the Ten Commandments. And yeah, the idea of being free from a law is exactly what freedom from slavery is about. So I love your image of we're now set free from somebody telling us constantly what to do, to actually know on this day you get to choose. And think about it, George, when you and Sasha were dating back in Grahamstown. What would you have chosen to do on a day when you had nothing else to do, or on a Sunday? You would have chosen to spend time with Sasha. You would not have gone off and done anything else. And that's the principle of the Sabbath, that we'll be drawn into spending time with our beloved and allow him to spend time with his beloved on that day. So it's no longer a law, but an expression of our voluntary communing with God.
Yes. Well, let's actually take that. Let's be very practical and make a few suggestions. We've come to that place now where we're talking about, what is acceptable in the Sabbath and what's not acceptable. And it's not so much the old Jewish rabbinical laws, but in a contemporary practice of Sabbath, what would you think would be essential elements or options? And what would be things that we should have to avoid, in terms of if I were to keep a Sabbath, let's say I planned from this week that on a certain day of the week, now for some it might be a Sunday, people who work sort of Monday to Friday. For you and I, it wouldn't be a Sunday, it would be another day of the week. What would we do and what would we not do on that particular day?
Well, I want to start with what's fascinating about the two articles I read that you sent me, which I'd read before actually when I hadn't realized. is that the goal is to spend an entire day. So, yeah, sure, we talk about, punctuating our day, perhaps with small Sabbaths, and perhaps if we can only take a morning, that is a good idea. But the goal, both in Peterson and Brown Taylor, is to take a full day, to take the full Sabbath somewhere, to find that day, that entire day. And the second thing is that image of the shepherd, that the shepherd's day does not begin at sunrise, but it actually begins at sunset, because that's when the sheep lie down. And from the minute the shepherd's eyes open in the morning, he's working with the sheep. But the minute the sheep go to sleep, the sunset starts the new day, and then what would happen is the shepherds would all sit down in a group, and they'd begin to share their stories. The relationships would be built, and the memories would be shared. The future hopes would be ignited in each other's hearts as they talked about what might happen and what could happen. Those quiet moments when there is nothing to do, and for us, we so often hear these stories about, switch off your phone and don't answer your emails. And so for many, that creates so much anxiety. But it is so important for us to find a space where we have nothing to do, to create that space. It's not going to be there for us. The world will, as Peterson says, the world lords and rewards those who indulge in the sin of sloth, which interestingly he equates to Sabbath breaking. But we won't get any help here, and we have to create the space where there is nothing to do. And as long as in our mind we see there is something to do in that space, we will not Sabbath. We will constantly be looking for those things. So it may mean for some switching off our emails, even finding someone else to administer our emails for that day, or some other way of administering them for that day, and getting away from the regular daily practices. But if we want to make it very simple for ourselves, it's to find that time to pray and to play. And I would begin with those two. There are so many other things we could do, and I have prayer books on my shelf. Peter Langeman and I shared the Liturgy of the Hours for a few years. We would get together once a week and do the Liturgy of the Hours together, and they're great disciplines. But if we aim too high, we will just exhaust ourselves and fill ourselves to death. If we find a way to pray in that day, a way to worship in that Sabbath, and we find a way to play. Playing is great, because if you play a game with somebody else, it just takes us, you have to spend that time doing it. A game of tennis or snooker or whatever your game is. But it also builds relationships. So playing a game with your wife, for instance, preferably not an online game, but playing a game with your wife can put you in a space where there is nothing else to do. And think about those childhood memories of sitting around the coloring in table, where you would have the coloring in books and you would talk to each other. No, I'm going to color Mickey Mouse's almond blue. It's a nonsense statement. It means almost nothing. And yet it's a statement that I have nothing better to do than simply color in this arm of Mickey Mouse. And those kind of very different moments where we might be able to find a place to play will just give us that space, especially when there's someone else to play with. And then as far as prayer goes, we often see prayer as, and I do, prayer books and discipline of praying certain prayers. But prayer can also be conversations. And if you've ever read the book Tuesdays with Maury, it's that kind of conversation which becomes prayer. And Henry Nouwen is excellent at this. Those times when we simply recognize that our conversation with another in a space of recognizing God's presence becomes prayer for us. I'd never thought of including others in my Sabbath. I'd thought that a Sabbath needs to be me and my. But that idea of having prayer as a conversation perhaps, and playing together and including somebody else in my Sabbath, well, that just makes sense for me as a beginning point. There are so many, George, you could help us with the disciplines and so many other things we could do practically. But those two beginnings, prayer and playing, perhaps with another.
I like that very much. It's easy to remember. Sabbath is about prayer and play, and there's no guilt. Prayer is not wasting time, and play is certainly not wasting time. And they're both absolutely essential for our well-being. I have wonderful memories of growing up of Sundays with cousins, and aunts and uncles. My aunt, and that family and my family. We spent Sundays together, and it started off at church, but then it ended. It continued throughout the afternoon with lots of play. French cricket, swimming in the pool. There were always activities or board games or listening to music or whatever. But of course there was also food, always food, a braai or a Sunday roast or a whatever. And it wasn't the sort of quality of the food necessarily, although it was always very tasty and so on. But it was the sharing, and everybody brought something, and it was not a burden. Nobody was in the kitchen all day because it was the work was shared and the enjoyment was shared, and there was always enough. And there were sometimes guests, that were not part of the immediate family, and there were sometimes unexpected guests who dropped in the afternoon after lunch. But they were just long, leisurely time, and no one felt guilty about not getting to something that they should do before they go back to work tomorrow. It was family time, and so play and prayer and food and togetherness. Those are all important facets. Now, there are a few things that I guess one has to not do in order to create that space. One of the things that you should not do is you should not engage in the work that you do in the other 6 days of the week. You should avoid it, and try to set curbs in place so that will assist you to avoid it. Your devices, as you mentioned before, you should feel free not to attend to them. And even something that may be an emergency will still be there. We're not doctors on call. Most of us are able to create some distance with the device. One of the things that somebody said, or wrote, which I thought might be an interesting thing to try, is to avoid buying things on a Sunday. Now, I mean, you and I grew up in an era when we were little where you couldn't buy anything on a Sunday because the shops were closed. So if you wanted to make a roast and you didn't have butter or whatever, then it was tough luck. You had to make a plan or not have it because you couldn't go and buy it. Well, now you can. So the temptation is so much more strong to go out and, do commercial things. But if you curb yourself and you perhaps plan better on the Saturday, or you make up for it on the Monday, then maybe that can enhance the time. And I'm sure there are other bits and pieces, but I don't think you and I need to make an exhaustive list. People can fill these in for themselves because we all know our problems and our temptations and how these things can derail rest for us or play for us. But I think if we start with those, play and prayer and perhaps relationship, family, and maybe food. It can be simple. You can have cold meats, and rolls, which are all bought from the shop the previous day and put out on a platter. That's a fantastic feast. And you don't have to do a thing in the oven or whatever. There doesn't have to be a huge expending of energy to get to that place. It can be light and easy, not so?
Yeah. One of the things, of course, trying to apply this to your and my life, George, because we are ministers, we have a different rhythm from the rest of the congregation in that Sunday is a work day for us, which is okay, and we may take another day of the week off. But something I've noticed in my family is my work-mindedness on the Sunday detracts from their Sabbath. And it's important for us as ministers to be aware of this. And if we do have to work on a Sunday, that we are able to Sabbath with our families. It's something I've thought of. For instance, there are presbytery meetings sometimes and other services on a Sunday afternoon, which we need to attend. And we do attend to other things, being a work day. And I'm not sure how we answer the question, but it is a factor in that our families need to Sabbath, and Sunday is their Sabbath. But how do we contribute into their Sabbath while at the same time being able to do the work we do? It is a conundrum, and I think many of my colleagues, our colleagues, have struggled with this for years.
Yes.
But it's so important that we create spaces to enable others to Sabbath as well, and that's the second part of both of the commands. There is always nobody must work. Not you, yes. Not your manservant, not your maidservant. And so I love Eugene Peterson's idea of getting his wife to commit to a weekly Sabbath with him on a Monday. And it's something we need to wrestle with. And the people who work on the day which is normally taken for worship and Sabbath is find that special day. Find the time when you can Sabbath with your family. And you can, cuddle up and watch a movie together during the time, or be around the bride together, play games, do things together as a family. So just a small note on us, on ministers, and us being aware of the
yes.
Difference of our Sabbath keeping.
Yeah. Tony, just two small points I want to make before we close, which were of interest to me. The first one is something that Bob Brown Taylor wrote about, and that is that the whole earth is included in the Sabbath. She writes, Sabbath is also God's gift to the tired fields, the tired vines, the tired vineyard, the tired land. Leviticus 25 shows divine concern for grapes for God's sake. It promises both the tame and wild animals in the land enough to eat, along with the hired hands who presumably have time to take up woodworking and water aerobics during the year, that the tractors stay parked in the barn. So everything is included, and often we think that the Sabbath, is just a human thing, but actually everything needs to rest. It's not just you and I. Everything, the fields need to rest. We can't just work them, as is our custom now with commercial farming and things like that. Work them to the very limit of existence. Everything needs to rest.
Yeah. George, I wonder, if when we close this, the last paragraph of Barbara Brown Taylor's article, it reads almost like a prayer. And I don't know if you have it in front of you.
Yes.
Possibly that you would read that, because it goes from page 139, that the very last bit, because it's just beautiful, and you read better than me, so it'd be great if you could read that at the end.
I'm happy to read it, and then just one other little point before we do that and close our session, and that is that all of the Sabbath enables us, you and I, to live in the expectation that we will meet God in ordinary everyday life. And that, I think, is so important. It's so easy to live without God, to be so caught up in the daily grind that we miss God altogether. But the Sabbath, when we play, when we slow down, when we pray, we start noticing God in everyday life. And I think that if that were the only consequence, then it would be worth doing. All right. Thank you for your time, Tony. And I'm going to read this as I close. And I so appreciate, and I just hope somebody who's watching this would give it a go, give it a try. Once a week, just try a day, 24 hours without, from sunset to sunset or sunrise to sunset, whatever, but give it a go and see what happens. Barbara Brown Taylor. When you live in God, your day begins when you open your eyes. Though you have done nothing yourself to open them, and you take your first breath, though there is no reason why this life-giving breeze should be given to you and not some other. In the dark or in the light, with a stone slab under your back or a feather topper, your day begins when you let God hold you, because you do not have the slightest idea how to hold yourself. When you let God raise you up, when you consent to rest, to show you get the point, since that is the last thing you would do if you were running the show yourself. When you live in God, your day begins when you lose yourself long enough for God to find you. And when God finds you, to lose yourself again in praise. You're right. It's absolutely beautiful. Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Tony.
Thanks so much, George.